It began the night Alex Turner moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of Asheville, North Carolina. He had always been fascinated by historic homes, and this one, with its creaking porches and ornate woodwork, seemed like the perfect place to start fresh after a messy breakup. The realtor had assured him the house was safe, recently inspected, and uninhabited for years. Alex didn't notice the way the wind seemed to whisper through the broken shutters or the way the trees pressed against the windows like hands. The first evening was normal. Alex unpacked, cooked a simple dinner, and watched TV. But around midnight, he woke to the faint sound of footsteps in the attic. He lived alone. The sound was slow, methodical, deliberate. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the old house settling. But the steps continued, moving rhythmically, echoing down the hallway and fading just as abruptly as they started. The next night, the footsteps returned, louder and closer this time, seemingly on the floor above his bedroom. Alex decided to investigate. The attic stairs creaked loudly as he ascended, but the space was empty, dust motes floating in the pale moonlight through cracked windows. Nothing explained the sounds. He left, uneasy, and tried to dismiss it as imagination. Within a week, small things began to go missing. A coffee mug here, a pair of gloves there. At first, Alex thought he had misplaced them, but the items always turned up in strange, improbable places, sometimes on shelves he never used, sometimes in corners he hadn't entered in days. One evening, he found his apartment key on the attic floor. He had no idea how it got there. Then came the whispers. At first, they were barely audible, like wind through the trees, almost imperceptible. Get out. Leave. Alone. They would come when he was alone in the house, more distinct as the nights wore on. Alex started recording audio, hoping to catch something, but when he played it back, the whispering had been edited in real time. He could hear syllables that weren't there before, words forming when he listened again, always saying the same thing. You belong here. With us. Terrified, Alex attempted to leave the house one night, only to find the front door wouldn't open. No matter how he jiggled the lock, it remained fixed. Windows wouldn't budge. He banged on the walls, screamed, called neighbors. Nothing worked. Finally, he retreated into the living room, feeling a suffocating presence around him. The first physical encounter happened soon after. He woke to a cold hand brushing his shoulder. He bolted upright, heart pounding, but no one was there. Every mirror reflected only him, alone. But sometimes, just for a second, a dark shape would appear behind him, a silhouette of a man, tall, broad, featureless. When he turned, it vanished. Alex researched the house and discovered its grim history. It had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Edward Crowley, rumored to have dabbled in the occult. Multiple residents had vanished or been found dead under mysterious circumstances. Crowley himself disappeared one stormy night, never to be seen again. Locals whispered that the house had never truly been empty. It housed something that lingered, feeding on fear, feeding on life. The activity escalated. Doors slammed without wind, walls groaned like living things, and the whispers became screams that only Alex could hear. At night, he saw them. Figures standing silently in corners, motionless, featureless, watching. He tried to leave again, but the streets outside seemed to twist unnaturally. Driving away became impossible. That the roads always led him back to the house, no matter how far he went. One stormy night, Alex woke to the sound of laughter, a low, guttural, human-like sound coming from the basement. Against his better judgment, he descended the stairs, flashlight shaking in his hands. The basement was pitch black, filled with the smell of damp wood and earth. At the far end, he saw them. Dozens of figures, all featureless, all staring. Their forms were humanoid but distorted, elongated, and as he shone his light, they moved closer with an unnatural, gliding motion. Alex fled upstairs, slamming the basement door. He called the police, insisting on an immediate check. Officers arrived hours later, but the basement was empty. The cameras Alex set up recorded nothing unusual, yet he knew what he had seen. Something was in the house with him, something ancient and patient, waiting. Sleep became impossible. He would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps pacing, doors opening and closing, whispers growing louder until they became unintelligible chanting. Sometimes he woke to find the furniture rearranged, chairs stacked on tables, cabinets open, objects strewn across the floor in patterns that made no sense. Alex reached out to a paranormal investigator named Samuel Drake, known for documenting unexplained phenomena. Drake arrived with a team and set up equipment throughout the house. They captured recordings of faint voices, electromagnetic anomalies, and cold spots. But the most disturbing footage came from a night vision camera in Alex's bedroom. At 2:32 a.m., a figure emerged from the corner of the room, tall, faceless, gliding silently toward him. The camera recorded it standing over his bed as if watching him sleep, before it vanished when Alex woke suddenly. The investigators advised him to leave immediately, but Alex couldn't. He felt trapped, not by doors or locks, but by the presence itself. The entity had latched onto him, following him wherever he went. He tried staying at friends' houses, hotels, even motels, but the same phenomena occurred. Shadows in the periphery of his vision, objects moving slightly, faint whispers that seemed to come from inside his head. Months passed. Alex became a recluse, documenting every event meticulously in journals and video logs. The entity's behavior shifted. It no longer merely haunted, it communicated. Symbols would appear on walls, scratched into surfaces, sometimes even on his skin when he awoke. Shapes moved in impossible ways, walls bending slightly, hallways extending beyond their logical length. One night, while reviewing footage, Alex noticed something impossible. A new figure had appeared in the recording. Unlike the faceless one, this figure had a face, crow-like, hollow eyes, a grin too wide to be human. It approached Alex slowly on the screen. When he looked up from the monitor, it was standing in the corner of the room in real life, watching. He couldn't move. He fled again, running into the rain-soaked streets, but the entity followed. Every reflective surface showed it, always in the same place, always patient, waiting. Eventually, he moved out of Asheville entirely, hoping distance would help. But the sightings persisted, flashes in mirrors, whispers in empty rooms, shadows at the edges of his vision. Alex Turner lives now in constant vigilance, never alone, never in one place for too long. He keeps lights on, cameras recording, doors double-locked, but he knows it waits, following him, watching, patient. He understands that the house was not just a building, it was a lure, a trap, and he had been caught. And now there is no escape. Sometimes, late at night, he sees a faceless figure in the corner of his new apartment. Sometimes he hears the faintest whisper, "You belong here," and he knows that one day he will. Story the end. It started in the winter of 2021 when I moved into a small, isolated cabin just outside Marquette, Michigan. I needed a quiet place to focus on writing, far from the distractions of the city. The cabin was cheap, rustic, and set back in the woods about a mile from the nearest neighbor. The realtor, a nervous young man, warned me that the previous owner had left suddenly, leaving most of the furniture behind. He laughed it off like it was nothing. I didn't care. Solitude was what I wanted. The first night, I settled in and unpacked my things. The cabin was old, floorboards groaned underfoot, and the heating stove rattled like it had a life of its own. I chalked it up to the wind and the age of the place. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside, scratching at the siding. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door, but the snow-covered ground was pristine, untouched. I shook my head and laughed nervously, telling myself it was a branch hitting the wall. By the third night, I noticed small things out of place. The fireplace poker was leaning at a different angle. The wood pile in the corner had a log moved to a spot I was certain I hadn't touched. I tried not to let it bother me. The isolation was beginning to get to me anyway. Then the whispers started. Low at first, indistinct. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt like they were right in my ear, though I was alone. The first time I heard them clearly, I woke at 2:13 a.m. to a voice saying, "You shouldn't be here." I froze, convinced it was a dream. But when I turned on the light, nothing was there. The next day, I found more evidence that I wasn't alone. The stove had been lit overnight. I was sure I had turned it off before bed. The snow outside my cabin door had footprints leading from the edge of the woods to my porch, though I had seen no one. They were human-sized, barefoot, and strange, too long and thin. My rational mind told me it was probably wildlife or a prank, but my gut screamed otherwise. That night, the scratching returned, louder, more persistent. I could hear it coming from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. I pressed my ear to the floor and felt vibrations, as if someone or something was walking just beneath the boards. The whispers came again, this time louder, We see you. I didn't sleep. I stayed up until dawn, pacing the cabin with a hatchet in hand. When the sun finally came, the snow outside my window was trampled. The footprints led right to the back door, which I had locked. No prints led away. I checked the door carefully. No signs of forced entry, but the lock had been turned. I called the realtor, hoping for an explanation, but he didn't answer. I tried to drive into town, but my car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, though it had been fine the night before. Panic began to settle in. I was trapped. That night, the whispers changed. They were no longer coming from the walls. They were inside the cabin. I could feel them moving around me, circling, murmuring unintelligible phrases, punctuated with the occasional leave. The scratching turned into pounding, and I heard breathing, deep, wet, ragged, right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Then I noticed the mirrors. My reflection was wrong. It moved slower than I did, lagging by a fraction of a second. When I waved, it hesitated, then mimicked me. When I turned away, I thought I saw a shadow step out of the reflection, tall, thin, impossibly long-limbed. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I packed what I could into my car and tried to leave again. The road out was blocked by fallen trees, heavy and impossible to move alone. The snow had shifted overnight, forming a thick barrier, as if the forest itself didn't want me to leave. I called 911, but the line was dead. My phone had no service. I spent the next 2 days barricaded inside, surviving on canned food and snow water. The shadows moved closer each night. I could feel them standing over me while I slept, their long limbs brushing my shoulders, their whispers filling my mind. We're here. Always. On the third night, the unthinkable happened. The basement door, which I had ignored until now, creaked open. I didn't even have a basement, I thought. But the cabin floorboards had rotted in one corner, revealing a hidden stairwell beneath a trapdoor. From it came the whispers, louder, insistent, urgent. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. Some invisible force held me in place. Then I saw it. The figure, stepping out of the trapdoor into the dim cabin light. It was tall, too tall, with spindly arms that reached the floor, and skin pale, almost translucent. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and it smiled with teeth that were too many and too sharp. Behind it, dozens more figures emerged from the trapdoor, filling the cabin with their unholy presence. The whispers became a chorus. You can't leave. You belong here. I ran, stumbling out into the snow, my lungs burning. The figures followed silently, gliding across the snow toward me. I don't know how I survived, but somehow I made it into the woods. I ran until my legs gave out, hiding in a hollowed tree trunk until dawn. When I returned to the cabin days later with the police, it was gone. Not abandoned. Gone. The clearing where it had stood was empty, as if it had never existed. The police were skeptical, blaming stress or cabin fever. But I know what I saw. I know what followed me. I moved back to the city after that, rented a small apartment in a busy building where the noise of neighbors and traffic drowned out any whispers. But sometimes at night, I hear scratching at my walls. Shadows move just beyond the edge of the light, and my phone occasionally lights up with texts from unknown numbers saying simply, "We see you." I have never gone back to the woods. I never will. Story the end. It was late September when Marcus moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio. The property had been abandoned for years, a creaking structure of peeling white paint and sagging porches. He had bought it cheaply, drawn by the solitude it promised and the chance to escape the city and his past. The locals gave him wary looks when he mentioned the purchase, warning him about the house's history, but he brushed it off. Ghost stories were just stories after all, right? The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. Marcus slept in the main bedroom on the second floor, a massive space with wooden floors and a high, slanted ceiling. The wind rattled the windows and the old boards groaned under their own age, but nothing unusual happened. The next morning, he began cleaning and unpacking, moving boxes into what he intended as his workspace. By the third night, strange things began. It started with the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his bedroom. At first, he thought it might be a raccoon or stray animal trapped inside, but when he called out, the sound stopped immediately, leaving an oppressive silence. His pulse quickened, but he tried to convince himself it was nothing. The next morning, Marcus noticed muddy footprints on the bedroom floor. They were small, childlike, leading from the hallway to the foot of his bed. He was alone in the house. No one had been there. He cleaned them, chalking it up to a prank by someone in town, though he hadn't told anyone he'd moved yet. Over the next few days, the noises grew more deliberate. Doors creaked open slowly, lights flickered, and sometimes a cold breeze would sweep through a room without explanation. Marcus's phone would occasionally turn on by itself, the screen lighting up with static, and once he saw the faint outline of a face in the corner of the screen before it went black. One night, around 2 a.m., Marcus awoke to a tapping sound on the ceiling above his bed. It was slow, deliberate, almost like nails scratching across wood. His heart raced as he sat up, trying to locate the source, but the room was empty. The tapping continued, moving in patterns that made no sense, circling above him, coming closer. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the ceiling, but the light revealed nothing. Days turned into nights of constant terror. Marcus began documenting the occurrences. Objects moving, shadows flickering at the edges of rooms, whispering voices that called his name. He installed cameras, hoping to catch evidence, but most footage showed nothing more than empty rooms, shadows that could have been tricks of light. One camera, however, captured something chilling. A figure, hunched and pale, crawling along the walls in a jerky, unnatural motion before disappearing into the darkness. The more Marcus tried to rationalize, the more impossible it became. The farmhouse seemed alive in ways that defied logic. Doors locked themselves and unlocked moments later. Footsteps echoed in rooms no one had entered. Sometimes he would wake to find himself lying on the floor in a different room, with no memory of getting there. One night, the entity made itself undeniable. Marcus was awake, watching footage from his cameras on his laptop, when he felt a weight press down on his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Whispers flooded his mind, urgent, almost shouting, though no sound left the room. The figure appeared in his vision, pale and hulking, its head too large, eyes voids of darkness, limbs bending at impossible angles. It leaned close, and Marcus felt the cold press of its presence on his skin, its breath on his face, though nothing was physically there. When he regained movement, he bolted from the room, trying to escape, but the farmhouse seemed to warp around him. Hallways twisted, doors led to rooms that hadn't existed moments before. Windows opened to darkness that stretched endlessly. The sense of being watched never left, the whispers echoing in his ears, insistent, commanding, promising pain if he resisted. Marcus tried to leave town, but even in his car, he felt eyes on him. Shadows moved in the rearview mirror when no one was behind him. Radio static would form words, calling his name. By the time he returned to the farmhouse, everything had changed. The walls were scratched with messages he hadn't written. "You cannot escape." Mirrors reflected not his own face, but the hollow, grinning visage of the figure. Desperate, he sought help from a local historian and a medium. The historian confirmed rumors. A previous family had vanished mysteriously, leaving the farmhouse abandoned for decades. The medium tried a cleansing ritual, but the entity ignored it entirely. It didn't live in the house. It lived in Marcus. After months of escalating terror, Marcus had stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly, living in near constant fear. Every reflective surface, every shadow, every creaking floorboard became a source of horror. The entity whispered to him constantly, a presence attached to his very being. He realized the terrible truth. He was never alone, and the entity did not need the farmhouse. It followed him, patient, eternal, and unstoppable. One night, Marcus awoke to the familiar cold pressure on his chest. The figure emerged from the darkness of the room, pale and smiling, whispering directly into his mind, "Forever." He tried to fight, screamed, flailed, but it was no use. The air itself seemed to resist him, thick and suffocating, pulling him into submission. When he awoke again, the room was quiet, but everything was different. Every mirror shattered, every shadow stretched unnaturally, and the whispers never ceased. Marcus's life became a waking nightmare. Friends stopped visiting, unable to handle the oppressive aura that clung to him. Work became impossible. He realized he could never escape, never be free. The entity didn't care for place or circumstance. It had claimed him, following wherever he went, whispering, scratching, haunting every corner of his life. Sleep was impossible. Peace, a memory. Every night, the same rhythm of terror. Whispers, scratches, shapes in the dark, shadows watching, waiting for the moment they could fully claim him. Years later, Marcus remained trapped in a life of fear and isolation. The farmhouse was long abandoned again, but the entity followed, eternal and unyielding. He could not leave it, could not destroy it, and it could not be appeased. Every reflection, every dark corner, every creaking floorboard reminded him, some things are not meant to be seen, not meant to be fought, and certainly not meant to be escaped. The entity existed simply to follow, to whisper, and to wait. Marcus had learned the hard truth. Once something like this attaches itself, nothing, not distance, not logic, not hope can free you. And every night in the quiet darkness, he hears the tapping, the scratching, the whisper of a voice that will never let him go. Story the end. It was early spring when I first arrived in Crestwood, a small, forgotten town tucked between the mountains of Northern Virginia. I'd taken a new job at a property management firm, overseeing foreclosed homes scattered through rural counties. The position was mostly quiet work, inspections, photographs, reports. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and after a messy divorce and too many years in the city, I was looking for quiet. Crestwood wasn't much more than a cluster of streets, a diner, a post office, and a faded main strip lined with abandoned shops. I rented a 2-bedroom house on the edge of town, not far from a long stretch of foreclosures called Black Hollow. My landlord, a middle-aged man named Reed, gave me a strange look when I mentioned taking that particular property. He paused, chewing the inside of his cheek, then said, "Just make sure you keep the porch light on after dark. Always." I laughed and nodded, but he didn't smile. The house itself was old but cozy. White siding, warped floors, the faint smell of damp wood. It sat alone, surrounded by tall grass and trees that seemed to crowd closer at night. I spent my first few days cleaning, unpacking, and adjusting to the silence. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. The first night, I noticed something strange. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate. I froze. Then came 3 sharp knocks on the front door. I peered through the peephole. No one was there. The porch light flickered once and went out. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The woods were completely silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just stillness. I flicked the porch light switch, but it didn't come back on. The bulb wasn't burned out. I'd checked it earlier. Still, I tried to convince myself it was a prank, maybe some local kids. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud just below the porch steps. Bare footprints. They were long and narrow, the toes oddly pointed, almost claw-like. I told myself it was a trick of the light, some kind of animal print distorted by rain. But something about them didn't feel right. I cleaned the mud away and tried to forget about it. A few days later, I was out doing inspections on the other side of town. Crestwood's outskirts were full of decaying homes, rotting porches, broken windows, furniture left behind as if people had just walked away mid-meal. At one house, I found a stack of old photographs in a drawer. They were Polaroids, grainy, overexposed. Every single one showed the same scene. A house identical to mine, and standing on the porch was a tall, faceless figure. I dropped the photos and left immediately. That night, I called Reed, my landlord, to ask if there had been incidents at the property before. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "You shouldn't go out after dark," he finally said. "Not near the woods, not when you hear knocking." When I asked him what that meant, he just hung up. The next few nights were quiet. I almost convinced myself it had all been coincidence. Then one night I woke around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of whispering. Faint, like someone talking outside my bedroom window. I sat up, straining to listen. The whispers were too soft to make out words, but they grew louder, closer. I pulled the curtain back just an inch. There was someone standing by the tree line. I could barely see them, just a shape, tall and still. I blinked, and they were gone. The next morning, I found handprints on the outside of my bedroom window. Long, thin fingers, like someone had pressed both palms against the glass while watching me sleep. After that, I stopped sleeping well. I started keeping a flashlight and a hammer by my bed. I double-checked every lock before going to sleep, left the porch light on like Reed said. For a few nights, nothing happened. Then, during a late-night storm, I heard it again. Knocking. 3 slow knocks. This time, they came from the back door. I held my breath, gripping the hammer. Rain pounded the roof, thunder rolled through the mountains. I waited, heart racing. Another 3 knocks, then another, on the front door this time. It was like something was circling the house. Then, through the noise of the storm, I heard a voice. Let me in. It was soft, childlike, a girl's voice. Every hair on my body stood up. I didn't move, didn't answer. The voice came again, this time from the window. Please, I'm cold. Lightning flashed, and for an instant I saw her. A small girl, maybe 9 or 10, standing outside in the rain, her dress soaked, her hair plastered to her face, but her eyes were completely black. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. When I looked again, she was gone. The rest of that night passed in terrified silence. The next morning, muddy footprints led from the porch around the entire house and disappeared into the woods. I drove straight into town, shaken. At the diner, I told one of the waitresses, a woman named Carol, what had happened. She stopped what she was doing, her face going pale. You saw her, didn't you? She whispered. I nodded. Carol said that years ago, before the town started dying, a family had lived in that house. Their daughter went missing one night. Search parties scoured the woods for weeks, but they never found her. Some said she'd fallen into one of the old mining shafts near the ridge. Others said she came back, but wasn't her anymore. Don't talk to her if she comes back, Carol said, gripping my wrist. Don't even look at her. When I asked what she meant, she just muttered, Once you see her, she follows. I didn't want to believe her. But that night, I woke to the sound of the porch light flickering again. It dimmed once, twice, then went out. The power stayed on inside the house, but the light outside, gone. I felt something shift in the air, a weight pressing down, and then came the knocking. Slow, heavy. But this time it wasn't just the door. It came from the walls, the floor. Like the house itself was being surrounded, wrapped in something that wanted in. I pressed my back to the wall, hammer clutched in my hand, listening. Then, from just beyond the window, I heard her voice again. Why won't you let me in? I couldn't move. Then I heard footsteps, bare feet slapping against wet wood, circling the house. The voice came from every side now, echoing, distorted. Please, it's cold. Please, open the door. I ran to the bedroom. I slammed the door shut and crouched in the corner, shaking. For hours, the knocking continued, rhythmic, patient. By dawn, it stopped. When I finally looked outside, I found small handprints pressed into every window, smeared across the glass. I called Reed again, but the number was no longer in service. I called my company to request a transfer. They agreed, but said it would take a week to process. That week felt like a lifetime. The following night, I woke again to a strange sound, something soft and rhythmic, coming from beneath the floorboards, like breathing. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the floor. The sound was faint but real, rising and falling steadily, as though something alive was buried there. The next day, I pried up a section of floor near where the sound had come from. The soil underneath was damp and black, with a faint, rotting smell. I dug until my hands bled. About a foot down, I found the corner of something wooden. I uncovered the rest, a small, rotted box. Inside were children's toys, a cracked porcelain doll, a ribbon, and a faded photograph of a little girl, the same one I'd seen outside. Her name, written on the back, was Lydia Raines. That night, I didn't bother locking the doors. It didn't matter anymore. The lights flickered. The knocking began again. But this time, I didn't hide. When I looked out the window, she was standing on the porch, drenched in fog, eyes black as tar. Her mouth opened wider than it should have, and her voice was everywhere, inside and outside at once. You found me. The power went out. Everything went black. I woke the next morning on the floor. The sun was up and everything seemed normal, except the front door was wide open. Outside, the grass was pressed flat in a wide circle, like something had been standing there for a long time. I packed that day and left Crestwood for good. I didn't even go back for my final paycheck. That was 3 months ago. I live 2 states away now, but the other night, just after midnight, I heard 3 soft knocks on my apartment door. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. Then a small voice whispered through the keyhole, soft, familiar. Please, I'm cold. Story the end. It was one of those brisk October evenings in upstate New York, where the air is crisp enough to make your lungs sting, and the fading sunlight casts long, jagged shadows across the skeletal trees. Jeremy had just left his office, a small insurance firm downtown, and was heading home. The streets were empty. save for the occasional jogger or stray car, and the dull hum of traffic from the main road barely penetrated the quiet suburban stretch he walked along. He had always liked the solitude of his neighborhood during fall, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the occasional hoot of an owl, the way streetlights flickered like hesitant sentinels in the dark. But tonight there was something different. A subtle sense of wrongness clung to the air, like the static before a storm. Jeremy's apartment building was an old brick structure from the 1930s. It had charm in daylight, the ivy creeping up its walls, the small wrought iron balcony railings, but at night it took on a more sinister tone. The flickering hallway lights and the faint smell of mildew made the place feel deserted, even though it was half full. He pushed open the heavy front door and inserted his key into the lock of his unit. As the door swung open, a cold draft met him, unusual because he was certain he had closed all the windows before leaving that morning. Shrugging it off as a minor draft, he stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the only illumination coming from the orange glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds. He tossed his coat on the chair by the entrance and flicked on the lamp. Nothing seemed out of place. His laptop was on the desk, his books were stacked neatly on the shelves, and the faint aroma of the leftover coffee from that morning still lingered. Still, the unease didn't leave him. He chalked it up to the long day and decided to take a shower to unwind. As the water heated, he heard it, a soft creak coming from the living room. His apartment was small, but the sound echoed unnaturally. He told himself it was probably the old floorboards settling, or maybe a cat wandering somewhere in the building. After his shower, Jeremy settled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, and opened his laptop to catch up on some work. He kept hearing subtle noises, faint tapping, almost like nails against wood. He paused and listened. It seemed to be coming from the bedroom. His heartbeat quickened. He told himself it was silly. The building was old. Noises like this were normal. Yet, there was a rhythm to the tapping that didn't feel accidental. It was deliberate, almost like it was following him, keeping time. He considered calling his neighbor, Mrs. Dillard, who had lived next door for decades and knew the building's quirks, but dismissed the idea. He didn't want to bother anyone. Besides, he reminded himself there was probably a simple explanation. Around 10:30 p.m., Jeremy decided to get ready for bed. As he walked toward his bedroom, he noticed something odd. The door, which he was certain he had locked that morning, was slightly ajar. His pulse quickened and a cold sweat broke across his forehead. He swore he had locked it. Maybe he'd been distracted, or perhaps he'd only closed it gently, not fully locking it. Still, a small, gnawing voice in his mind whispered that something wasn't right. He pushed the door open fully, but nothing seemed amiss. Clothes were neatly folded, his drawers intact. He laughed nervously at himself, attributing the fear to the tiredness from work. Lying in bed, Jeremy tried to sleep, but the tapping returned. Only now it was softer, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably close. He strained to hear it over the sound of his own breathing. It wasn't coming from the bedroom. It seemed to be inside the room, closer, like it was right above his head. He sat up, heart hammering, and the hair on his arms stood on end. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was heavier than the darkness itself. He tried to calm himself. Maybe a branch from the old oak outside was scraping the window. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine, but sleep refused him. Hours passed in fitful, uneasy dozing. Around 2 a.m., a faint scratching sound began at the foot of his bed. Jeremy froze. The scratching was deliberate and persistent, like fingernails dragged across the floor. He reached for his phone, intending to turn on the flashlight, but it wasn't on the nightstand where he always left it. The fear in his chest grew, tightening like a vice. The scratching grew louder, moving closer to the side of the bed. He pulled the blanket over himself, paralyzed with fear, praying it was a bad dream. Then he heard it. A whisper, soft and wet, coming from the darkness near the corner of the room. Jeremy. The voice was his own age, male, but distorted somehow, slurred like it was underwater. His breathing hitched, and he forced himself to turn on the lamp. Nothing. The bedroom was empty. He got out of bed, every step hesitant, trying to rationalize. Maybe someone had broken in? No. Nothing was missing. The windows were still locked. The door was closed. His heart was racing. He grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed and checked every corner. Empty. Thinking he might be losing his mind, Jeremy decided to call a friend, someone to just talk to until he calmed down. He dialed Mike, his old college roommate, and told him everything. The tapping, the scratching, the whisper. Mike laughed nervously. Dude, maybe you're just stressed. I mean, it's creepy, yeah, but maybe it's just your imagination. Jeremy agreed, trying to convince himself as much as he did Mike. He hung up, but as he set the phone down, the whisper came again, this time closer, right next to his ear. Don't move. Jeremy spun around, swinging the bat wildly. Nothing. The air felt thick, almost viscous, pressing against him, and then he saw it, the reflection in the mirror across from the bed. A figure, pale, hunched, its head too large for its body, eyes dark voids staring directly at him. It wasn't moving, yet its presence was suffocating, a dark weight in the room. Jeremy's scream caught in his throat. He swung the bat again, but the figure didn't react. And then, without warning, it vanished. The next morning, Jeremy tried to convince himself it was a hallucination, induced by stress or lack of sleep. But when he entered the kitchen for coffee, he noticed scratches across the floorboards, deep gouges leading from the living room to his bedroom. He was certain they hadn't been there the night before. His stomach turned. And worse, a message was written across the bathroom mirror in condensation. I see you. He called the police, who came and searched the apartment. They found no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone living in or hiding in the unit. The scratches were real, they confirmed, but no fingerprints or DNA could be collected. Jeremy's story didn't make sense to them, and he was told it was probably a prank or stress-induced delusion. He returned home that night, exhausted and terrified, but determined not to let fear control him. For the next week, Jeremy tried to keep his routine, though sleep eluded him. Each night, he heard the tapping, the scratching, whispers that made him flinch in terror. And each morning, he found new signs, the mirror fogged with words he hadn't written, small objects moved to impossible places, shadows flickering against walls that had no light. He installed cameras, hoping to capture something tangible. The first night, the footage was normal. The second night, one camera recorded a dark figure crawling across the ceiling above his bed. Its movements were unnatural, almost jerky, like a puppet being dragged across wire. Jeremy stared in disbelief. He showed the footage to the police and to Mike. Mike refused to stay over, claiming he couldn't handle what he had seen. On the fourth night, Jeremy woke to find himself unable to move. Paralysis gripped him, his heart pounding in his ears. The whispers were louder now, insistent all around him. He could feel the presence inching closer. Then, a hand, not fully formed, shadow-like, but tangible enough to press against his arm, rested on his chest. He couldn't scream. He couldn't breathe. And then the whispers formed words, slow, deliberate, cutting into his mind. You cannot leave. By morning, the hand was gone, the paralysis lifted, but the fear remained, heavier than ever. Jeremy packed a small bag, took the footage, and left the apartment. He told the police he was moving, and they didn't question him further. But the signs followed him. In his new apartment, he found scratches on the walls in the exact pattern from his old unit. Mirrors fogging with the same words, faint whispers when the lights were off. Jeremy realized it wasn't tied to the apartment. It had attached itself to him. Desperate, he researched paranormal activity, contacted mediums, and sought every explanation from the psychological to the supernatural. Each attempt ended the same. Nothing could stop it. The figure, the whispers, the scratches, they followed. Friends refused to stay over, claiming an uneasy feeling that made them leave immediately. Jeremy became isolated, sleeping with lights on, doors locked, security cameras everywhere. But it didn't matter. The entity didn't need a place to live. It lived in him now. One night, nearly 6 months after the first incident, Jeremy awoke to his bedroom filled with a thick black fog. Shapes twisted inside it, moving against the wall, crawling toward him. The whispers now roared inside his head, calling his name, commanding him to act, to open, to submit. He grabbed his bat, swinging blindly, screaming into the fog, but it passed through as if it weren't real. Then he felt it. Pressure on his chest, weight on his body, a sense of being pressed into the mattress as if the air itself was alive. He tried to fight, but his strength was meaningless. Through the fog, a face appeared, grinning, pale, hollow-eyed, whispering one last time, "Forever." Jeremy woke the next morning on the floor, the fog gone, but his apartment in disarray, every mirror shattered. He knew, with terrifying clarity, it had left a part of itself in him that night. No matter where he went, what he did, the fear, the whispers, the scratches, they were his shadow now. And he realized the truth. It didn't need a home, it didn't need a body, it only needed him. Every night he hears it, soft tapping at first, then scratching, then whispering. He has accepted that sleep will never come easy again. Every reflection in glass, every shadow in a corner, every chill in the air brings him back to that first night, that first encounter. And he knows one day the entity will no longer hide. One day it will take the rest of him. Until then, Jeremy lives in a state of quiet terror, haunted in his own home, forever followed by something that doesn't exist, yet is undeniably real. Story the end. It was a cold October evening in upstate New York when I first realized that something about the town I had just moved to was off. I had taken a job at a small logistics company in a rural area, drawn in by the promise of quiet life and cheap rent. My apartment was in a converted farmhouse, isolated, surrounded by a few other scattered homes and stretches of woods that went on for miles. I had driven down from the city, my old apartment left behind with all its noise and neighbors and distractions, eager for the peace of this new life. But I didn't know it yet. I would soon find out. Peace has a way of masking things you don't want to see. The first night, I remember feeling uneasy, though I chalked it up to nerves. The house creaked in ways that made me tense. Old wood shifting, wind rattling windows. I unpacked in silence, the glow of the single lamp in the living room casting long shadows across the walls. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing faint scratching from the walls. At first, I assumed it was mice or rats, something normal for a rural house. But the sounds weren't consistent with rodents. They came from the same spots at regular intervals, as if someone or something was pacing just beyond the wall, listening. Work was normal for the first few days. The company was small, family-run, and I got along with most people. They welcomed me, but there was a subtle coldness in the way they spoke, a hesitance that felt like caution. One man, my supervisor, would sometimes glance at me with a look that felt more like fear than friendliness. He never explained it, and I didn't press, figuring it was just his personality. After a week, the noises in the apartment became harder to ignore. It wasn't just scratching anymore. I started hearing faint voices, whispers that seemed just out of reach, incomprehensible but urgent, almost demanding attention. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, stress from the move, or maybe the isolation playing tricks on me. I began to notice other oddities. The furniture would sometimes shift slightly. Objects in my kitchen or living room moved just a few inches, as if someone had touched them. One night, I woke up at around 3 a.m. to the sound of someone breathing in my bedroom. My heart raced. I had locked all the doors. The windows were shut. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and I felt a presence in the room with me. I froze, staring into the darkness, and then I saw it, at the foot of my bed, a dark, shadowy figure, taller than a human, almost blending with the darkness, but with a faint outline that suggested form. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It tilted its head as if studying me, and then slowly, impossibly, it dissolved into the shadows of the room. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I tried to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis? A nightmare? But the scratches on my walls, which I had ignored until then, had become deep, jagged, almost claw-like marks. They hadn't been there the night before. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. The whispers became louder, and sometimes they were clearer, words I couldn't understand, but tones of anger, frustration, and sadness. I started finding small objects in my apartment that weren't mine. A pair of children's shoes, a broken doll, a twisted piece of wire shaped like a figure. Nothing was ever in the same place twice. One evening, I came home from work to find my front door wide open. I lived alone. I knew I had locked it. Inside, my apartment was ransacked, but nothing was stolen. Drawers pulled out, clothes tossed on the floor, photographs turned upside down. And in the center of the living room, scrawled in a dark substance I didn't recognize, was a message. "Don't look." I panicked, called the police, but they found nothing. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. They suggested maybe it was a prank, maybe I was under stress. I didn't know what to believe anymore. A week later, I started seeing her. A girl, maybe 10 or 12, pale skin, dark eyes, standing in the corner of my living room. She didn't speak, didn't move when I approached, just watched me. Over time, she began appearing more frequently, in the kitchen, in my bedroom, even outside my apartment window when I returned from work. I asked neighbors if anyone had children, if anyone had seen her. No one had. They looked at me like I was insane. Then the dreams started. They were always the same. I was walking through the woods behind my apartment, following a narrow trail. The trees were impossibly tall, their branches intertwining overhead so the sky was almost completely blocked. At the end of the path, I would find a small house, dark, abandoned, and inside I'd see people hanging from the ceiling by ropes, their faces contorted in terror. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, and sometimes I'd find the same objects from my dreams in my apartment. I tried leaving. I drove to the city for a weekend, but the feeling followed me. Every shadow seemed alive. Every reflection in a window or mirror felt wrong. I couldn't escape it. Then came the night it spoke. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when the whispers became clear words. "You can't leave." I froze. The girl was there, standing silently, her head tilted. Her mouth opened, and in a voice that was both childish and ancient, she said, "You belong here." I ran, got into my car, and drove away. But no matter how far I went, the feeling of being watched never left. I stayed with friends in the city for a week. The city should have been safe, loud, filled with people, but I couldn't escape the shadows. They appeared in reflections on subway windows, in puddles on the street, in every mirror I passed. My friends noticed my paranoia, but I couldn't explain it. When I returned to my apartment, I found everything worse. The scratches were deeper, the messages more explicit. "Don't leave. Stay forever. We see you." The girl was no longer just in corners. She would appear suddenly in front of me in places where she couldn't possibly be. Once I opened my bedroom door, and she was sitting on my bed, looking at me with that same empty expression. I contacted a paranormal investigator, skeptical but desperate. He came, walked through my apartment, took photographs, used equipment, and told me he had never seen anything like it. EMF readings spiked, cameras recorded shadows moving independently of any person. And one night, he even reported hearing a voice behind him whispering, "Leave now." We tried cleansing rituals, prayers, salt lines, burning sage. Nothing worked. Every attempt seemed to anger whatever was in the house. The shadows became aggressive, objects would fly across rooms, and the girl started appearing in dreams of anyone who entered the apartment. I eventually quit my job, sold my belongings, and left. But the nightmares, the shadows, the whispers, they followed me. I moved from state to state, tried living in cities, tried staying with friends, but they found me. They are in the reflections of windows, in the darkness of rooms, in the quiet moments when no one else is around. I've come to accept that I cannot escape it. I live in constant fear, always checking locks, always looking over my shoulder, always avoiding mirrors at night. I can feel them watching, always watching, waiting. Sometimes in my sleep I see her, standing at the foot of my bed, and when I wake I see the marks she left on my apartment walls, deep and jagged, even though I don't live there anymore. I know that if I ever stop moving, if I ever settle, they will come. They will take me back to that place, to the farmhouse, to the shadows. And the girl, she will be waiting, smiling. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. I don't know how much longer anyone can. I only know one thing with certainty. You cannot run from what is patient, what is ancient, what waits in the dark for you to close your eyes. And now, even as I type this, I can hear it. The scratching behind the walls, the whispering just beyond the door, and sometimes, just sometimes, I feel her standing there, watching me, waiting. Because some things never let you go. Story the end. It started in late November, just as the first snow had fallen across northern Wisconsin. I had accepted a seasonal job as a caretaker for an abandoned lodge up in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. The owners were out of state, only visiting occasionally, and they wanted someone to keep an eye on the property through the winter, keep the heating running, and make sure no vandals caused trouble. I liked the idea. Remote solitude, a quiet place to work, and extra money during the slow season. The lodge itself was massive, built in the 1920s, with high ceilings, sprawling corridors, and dark wood paneling that gleamed even under layers of dust. I moved in the first day, carrying the essentials and a few boxes of food. Everything felt normal, the kind of normal you expect when you step into a deserted place. That night, I unpacked and settled in, enjoying the silence. But as the evening wore on, I started noticing little things: footsteps in the hallway, faint creaks as if someone else were moving about, doors shutting softly on their own. I told myself it was the old building settling, the wind outside rattling the shutters. The second night, I woke to the sound of laughter, low, hollow, childlike, echoing down the hallway outside my room. I froze, listening. It stopped almost immediately, but the hair on my arms stood on end. I called out, but no one answered. The next morning, I chalked it up to wildlife, maybe an animal trapped inside, or my imagination adjusting to the stillness of the lodge. The next week, strange things escalated. I found footprints in the snow around the lodge, small, barefoot prints that circled the building but didn't lead to or from the woods. Doors I had locked were unlocked when I returned. Objects moved from one room to another, sometimes stacked neatly, sometimes scattered. I tried not to let it bother me, but every night the sounds grew louder: whispers, laughter, even sobbing. One night, I awoke to a tapping on my window. I live on the second floor, so I initially thought it was a branch. But the snow outside hadn't moved, and when I shone my flashlight on the glass, I saw a face pressed against it. Pale, wet-looking skin, wide black eyes staring directly at me. I screamed, stumbled back, and when I looked again, it was gone. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair, staring at the window, flashlight in hand. The next day, I found more evidence that I wasn't imagining things. The kitchen was a mess. Plates stacked on the counters, chairs pulled out, and strange marks etched into the wood floor. They looked like claw marks, deep scratches in a pattern I couldn't recognize. That's when I saw her for the first time. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9, standing at the top of the grand staircase. She wore a tattered white dress, hair long and wet, and she stared at me without moving. I froze. She didn't speak, she didn't blink, but I felt her presence pressing against my mind. After a few moments, she vanished, leaving only the cold, damp smell of mildew behind. Sleep became impossible. Every night, the whispers grew louder, the laughter closer. I started dreaming of the lodge itself. Dark, endless hallways filled with shadows. The girl appeared in my dreams, always standing silently, sometimes pointing, sometimes just watching. And when I woke, I'd sometimes find traces from the dream in reality. A chair tipped over, a door slightly open, faint footprints on the wooden floor. One evening around midnight, I decided to check the old storage rooms in the basement. I'd avoided them because the air felt thick and heavy down there, and the stairs groaned with every step. The basement was huge, full of stacked furniture, broken appliances, and shelves with rusted tools. As I walked deeper, I heard someone whisper my name. Sarah. I froze. My name isn't Sarah. The voice sounded soft, pleading, almost desperate. Then a cold gust blew past me, extinguishing my flashlight. In the pitch black, I felt it. Tiny fingers brushing against my ankle. I yelped and scrambled upstairs, shaking uncontrollably. After that, I knew I had to leave. But when I tried calling the owners, the line was dead. My phone lost service as soon as I stepped outside. The snowstorm that had been forecasted hit harder than expected. Roads were impassable. I was trapped in the lodge. Over the next few nights, the girl became more aggressive. She appeared in every corner of the lodge, always staring, sometimes moving silently behind me, sometimes standing just outside my bedroom door. The whispers became voices. You can't leave. Stay with us. Come play forever. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and I started seeing shadows in every reflective surface. Mirrors showed not only my reflection, but other figures standing behind me, fading when I turned my head. One night, I awoke to the sound of the front door slamming open. Snow blew in, covering the hallway. Footsteps crossed the floor, heavy and dragging, like someone or something was pacing. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and ran outside into the storm, hoping to reach my truck. But as I passed the trees, I realized the tracks in the snow weren't just mine. They circled me. Dozens of small barefoot footprints appearing out of nowhere, coming closer with every step. I reached my truck and started the engine, praying it would start. It did, barely. I drove as fast as the snow allowed, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at me, motionless. And behind her, Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their faces pale, their mouths open in silent screams. I didn't stop driving until dawn. When I finally reached the town, I tried to report what had happened, but the locals looked at me like I was insane. One man mentioned the lodge had a dark history, a series of mysterious deaths, missing children, and an arson fire decades ago. The authorities had closed it down and left it abandoned, but apparently, locals still whispered about the spirits that never left. I moved out of the area immediately. I thought that distance would be enough to keep it away. But even now, years later, I wake up at night to whispers, the sound of small footsteps, and sometimes the faint smell of snow and mildew. Occasionally, I'll glance at a window or mirror and see her, just for a moment, staring at me. And when I do, I know she's waiting, patient, somewhere out there, ready for the next person to come too close. No matter how far I go, no matter how often I move, I can still hear her. The little girl who waits in the shadows, who laughs, who whispers, who drags you slowly into the cold, endless dark. And now, whenever the wind blows through my neighborhood trees, I swear I hear her soft, pleading voice, "Come play with us." Story the end. It started the way most small-town nightmares do, quietly, almost imperceptibly. I had just moved to this little corner of Pennsylvania, a sleepy, post-industrial town that had more boarded-up shops than open ones, and the kind of people who didn't so much make friends as quietly accept you as part of the background scenery. I was a journalist by trade, which was part of why I ended up here. I'd been sent to cover the decline of industrial towns for a series in my magazine, and this place was an ideal case study. What I didn't expect was how it would slowly start to feel like the story was covering me instead of the other way around. I rented an old house on the edge of town, right where the asphalt ended and the fields began to swallow everything in shadow. The previous tenant, a man named Frank, had left in a hurry, or so the realtor claimed. He didn't want to talk about why. The house itself was nothing special. A two-story clapboard with peeling paint, a creaky porch, and an attic that smelled faintly of mildew and old newspapers. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy the first time I walked in. It wasn't exactly the architecture or the dust. It was the way the shadows seemed to linger in the corners, even during the day, the way the floorboards groaned like they were speaking to one another. The first night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to the sound of scratching, soft at first, like a rodent in the walls. By 3 a.m, it had grown louder, more deliberate. I went to check, flashlight in hand, and found nothing. Not a single mouse or rat, no loose boards, nothing. I told myself it was the wind or my imagination. But when I returned to bed, the scratching followed me, now from the attic above. Over the next few days, odd things started happening. Items would disappear from my apartment, only to reappear in places they couldn't have gotten to by themselves. I would leave my laptop on the kitchen table, walk into the living room, and find it sitting neatly on the bed. My keys vanished constantly, and sometimes I'd hear faint whispers as I moved through the house, too quiet to make out words, but distinct enough to send chills down my spine. I started talking to some locals, trying to get a sense of the town. Everyone was friendly, but tight-lipped about the past. Some mentioned Frank, the previous tenant. He'd been here less than a year before vanishing without a trace. Nobody seemed to want to talk about what happened to him. That alone made me more curious than cautious. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the front door opening. My heart sank. I live alone. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the noise. When I got to the living room, I saw footprints in the dust on the floor, a trail leading from the door to the stairs, but the door was locked from the inside. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I had forgotten to lock it properly. But that didn't explain the footprints. They were small, child-sized, and they didn't belong to me. I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence. At first, it was just minor stuff, whispers, misplaced objects, creaks. But then it escalated. I began seeing things out of the corner of my eye, figures standing in doorways, watching me, always just far enough that when I turned, they vanished. Shadows moved independently of the light. Once, I woke to see a dark shape crouched at the foot of my bed, and it didn't move when I screamed. I bolted upright, and it was gone. The town didn't make it easier. There was a sense of knowing in the air, like the residents were aware of something but bound by fear or superstition to never speak of it. I started digging into local history, checking newspaper archives. That's when I stumbled upon the series of disappearances. Not just Frank, but at least a dozen others over the last 20 years, all connected to houses on the outskirts of town, near abandoned fields or old mills. Patterns emerged. Young adults, often recent arrivals, always living alone, always disappearing without a trace. One evening, I was working late in the living room when my laptop screen flickered. Then it went black. I muttered under my breath, jiggled the plug, and it came back on. But the files I'd been working on were gone, replaced with photos, grainy, black and white images of my own house from angles I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a prank, but then I realized the photos were taken from inside the walls. There were pictures of me sleeping, of me walking through the rooms, taken from spaces that didn't exist, or at least I couldn't access. I tried to leave town. I booked a bus ticket and packed a bag. But as I stepped outside, I noticed the sky had darkened unnaturally fast. The road that should have led to the highway curved impossibly, looping back toward the town. I drove in circles for hours. Cell service dropped to zero. Every exit sign I saw pointed back here. I began to feel like the town itself was alive, like it had a consciousness that didn't want me to leave. Sleep became impossible. Every night, the whispers grew louder. I began hearing voices inside my head, repeating my own thoughts back at me, twisting them. Sometimes they'd whisper things I hadn't even thought yet. The shadows coalesced into forms I could almost recognize. A man standing in the corner, watching, but whenever I blinked, he was closer. I started seeing him in mirrors and reflective surfaces, even in photographs I took with my phone. One night, I found a hidden door in the attic. It had been covered with old boards and wallpaper, invisible until I knocked on it and felt a hollow echo. I pried it open and found a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. I felt an irresistible pull, like the house wanted me to go down. I went, flashlight shaking in my hands. At the bottom, I found a room carved entirely into the earth. The walls were covered with names scratched into the dirt, dozens of them, some dating back decades. At the center of the room was a large pit, and I realized with a stomach-churning certainty that this was where the missing people had been taken. The air was thick with the smell of rot, the ground littered with old, decayed clothing. My flashlight fell on something that made my blood run cold. A diary belonging to Frank. I read it in trembling hands. He had discovered the same whispers, the same shadows, the same invisible surveillance. He had tried to leave town, but found the roads looping endlessly back. He wrote about hearing voices in his dreams, telling him to come to the pit. The last entry ended mid-sentence. I hear them calling. They won't let me. And then the page was smeared with something dark. I dropped the diary and stumbled back upstairs. The house groaned around me, the walls seeming to pulse. The shadows were no longer content to linger. They moved aggressively, slamming doors, breaking windows, whispering directly in my ear. I ran outside, but the town had changed. The streets were unfamiliar. Houses that had been boarded up now seemed occupied. Figures in the distance watched me, motionless, their faces blank. I tried the bus again the next morning, but it never came. Even the gas station attendants looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. They offered no help. One old man muttered, "They don't let anyone leave once they've been noticed." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked away. Days blurred together. I tried calling friends and family, but every line was dead. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The figures became bolder, standing in my doorway, on the porch, even in the back seat of my car when I drove. One night, I woke up to find my front door wide open, muddy footprints leading from it straight into my living room. I could hear breathing behind me, low and wet, but when I turned, I was alone. I started noticing changes in myself. My reflection began to look subtly wrong. Eyes a fraction too large, shadows under my skin that shouldn't be there. My journal entries, which I had been keeping meticulously, sometimes contained phrases I didn't remember writing. Things like, "You belong here now, you will never leave." One evening, I tried a desperate measure. I set fire to the house. I thought maybe destroying it would free me from the grip of whatever haunted this town. Flames licked the walls, smoke filled every room, and I ran into the night. But the town didn't burn. The fire refused to take hold. In the morning, the house was intact, as if nothing had happened. And then I noticed something else. My reflection in the window wasn't quite right. It was grinning at me. I eventually stopped trying to fight. I live now like the others, hiding during the day, moving silently through the town at night. I've learned that there are places you cannot leave once they've marked you. The whispers follow me everywhere. At times I hear Frank's voice mixed with mine, warning me, laughing, pleading. Sometimes new residents arrive, fresh faces, curious souls. I watch them, knowing they are next. And when they look into my eyes, I see the same terror I once felt. It is inescapable. It is patient. It waits for those who think they are alone. And now I have become part of it, part of the story that the town tells to itself, to trap anyone who dares to come too close. There are nights when I stand at the edge of town staring out at the highway that should lead out of this nightmare. But it doesn't. It twists and bends like a living thing, pulling the unwary back into the streets, into the shadows, into the whispers. I've learned the hard way. The town doesn't just want to be observed. It wants to consume. And the worst part is, even after decades of knowing this, I still hold on to hope. Hope that someday, somehow, someone will come for me, someone who can break the cycle. But I've stopped believing. I've become a cautionary tale, a whisper in the night. And sometimes, if you drive too close to this town, you can see a figure moving just beyond the edge of the streetlights, watching, waiting. Perhaps you'll mistake it for a shadow, a trick of your eyes, but it is not. It is a warning, and it is patient. It remembers you. I write this now not as a plea, but as a record, so that if anyone finds this, you will understand the danger of curiosity, the inevitability of what waits in places no one leaves, and the insidious way a town can consume a soul. I have tried everything, and the only truth I have found is that some nightmares are not meant to end. They simply wait quietly until the next person walks too close. I hear them now, outside my window, whispering my name. I know what they want, and I know in the deepest part of me that I am already theirs. Story the end. It was a rainy Thursday evening in late October when Mark Henderson's life started to unravel in a way that defied all logic. He lived in a small, somewhat isolated town in northern Pennsylvania, a place that prided itself on quiet streets and friendly neighbors. Mark had just moved into a modest two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town after landing a new job at a local logistics company. He'd rented it because it was cheap, close to work, and, most importantly, quiet. At least that's what the listing had promised. The first night was uneventful. Mark unpacked a few boxes, ordered pizza, and settled in front of the TV with the rain drumming against the roof. As he drifted off to sleep that night, he had a fleeting thought that the house felt colder than it should, but he dismissed it. The heat was on. Maybe he was just imagining it. Around 2:13 a.m., he woke to the sound of what he thought was the wind hitting the windows. The rain was heavier now, almost relentless, and it rattled against the panes with a force that made the house groan. Then he heard it, a faint scratching, almost imperceptible at first, coming from the kitchen. He froze, listening. It sounded like fingernails on wood, slow and deliberate. He told himself it was a branch hitting the siding. But as he lay there, the scratching grew closer, more defined, now echoing through the hallway outside his bedroom. Mark got up cautiously, heart pounding. He flicked on the lights in the hall. Nothing. The kitchen was empty, the counters spotless. The rain's rhythm outside had drowned most of the sound, but it felt like something lingered. He shrugged it off, locking the doors out of habit, and went back to bed, convincing himself it was just nerves. The next day was a normal workday. Mark told himself he was overreacting, but the unease stuck with him. When he returned home, the house seemed darker, quieter. He noticed a small, muddy footprint on the kitchen tile. It wasn't his. He lived alone. He checked the doors. They were all locked. The windows, too. He scrubbed the footprint away, chalking it up to a trick of the mud from his shoes. It started happening almost nightly after that. Small things. Doors left slightly ajar when he was sure he'd closed them. The smell of something damp and decaying that seemed to appear and vanish, and most unnervingly, the feeling of being watched. He'd sit in his living room, reading, and swear he saw shadows flit at the edges of his vision, just long enough to make his stomach twist into knots. One Friday night, the scratching returned, but louder, more insistent. It wasn't at the kitchen this time, it was at the back door. Mark hesitated before approaching. His hands shook as he lifted the chain lock and swung the door open. The backyard was soaked, nothing but rain and mud, but near the tree line he thought he saw a figure. A man? A shadow? He blinked, and it was gone. Shaken, Mark considered calling the police, but what would he say? I think someone's outside my house, but they vanish every time I look. The logical part of him knew it made no sense. The police would laugh him off. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A week later, it escalated. He woke to the sound of whispering in his bedroom, faint and indistinct, as though someone was talking just behind the walls. The room was empty, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then stopped abruptly. Mark sat in bed, drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He felt an icy hand grip his shoulder. He jumped up. Nobody was there. Determined to find a rational explanation, Mark installed security cameras around the house. He even left one in the living room, pointing toward the hallway, convinced he'd finally catch whatever, or whoever, was causing these disturbances. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. Then, on the third night, at exactly 3:07 a.m., the cameras captured it. At first, it looked like a shadow moving across the hallway, but as Mark watched in disbelief, the shadow coalesced into the shape of a man about 6 feet tall, wearing what looked like old, tattered clothing. The man had no face, just a featureless darkness where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. He moved slowly, deliberately, and then vanished as suddenly as he appeared. The footage was grainy, but Mark knew what he had seen. Terrified, Mark called a local historian he had met at work, hoping someone could explain the history of the house. What he learned chilled him to the bone. The property had been abandoned for nearly 30 years before he moved in. The previous owner, a man named Thomas Whitaker, had vanished one night during a rainstorm, and his body was never found. Rumor had it that neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the house in the weeks leading up to Whitaker's disappearance. Scratching, whispering, footsteps at odd hours. Nobody ever solved it. Mark began sleeping in the living room with all the lights on. He tried sage, salt lines, anything he could find online about warding off spirits. Nothing worked. The presence grew bolder. It started moving objects, cups, dishes, a chair here, a book there. Always subtle, but always deliberate. Mark's sleep became fractured, nightmares blending with reality. He woke to the sound of breathing next to his bed, or what sounded like footsteps climbing the stairs when he was sure nobody was in the house. One night, after 3 weeks of escalating events, Mark woke to the sound of the front door slamming open. He grabbed his baseball bat and ran toward it, flashlight in hand. Outside, the rain was falling in sheets, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, except for a single muddy footprint leading away from the door and toward the edge of the property. He shined the flashlight, following the trail. It stopped abruptly at the tree line, disappearing as if it had never been there. By this point, Mark had stopped trying to rationalize anything. He no longer attempted to lock doors or hide from the presence. It seemed to exist outside the rules of reality. One evening, he returned home from work to find the interior of the house rearranged. Furniture stacked strangely, walls smeared with mud that spelled out words he couldn't comprehend. He took pictures, documenting everything, but even in photographs, the words appeared to shift when he looked at them a second time. Mark's breaking point came one night when he awoke to a man standing at the foot of his bed. Not a shadow, not a fleeting figure on a camera, a real, tangible man, or at least he felt real. His skin was pale, almost translucent, eyes black voids, and he smiled with a grim, knowing expression. Mark froze. The man whispered something in a voice that seemed to crawl directly into his skull. "You shouldn't be here." Mark ran. He fled into the rain, barefoot, dressed only in his pajamas, and didn't stop until he reached the main road. The town was quiet, the streets slick with rain. When he returned with police the next morning, the house was empty. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of anyone living there. The footprints outside were gone. The security cameras, which had captured the faceless man, were destroyed, screens shattered from the inside. The police suggested Mark had a breakdown, perhaps triggered by isolation and stress. Friends and coworkers sympathized, but quietly questioned his sanity. Mark moved in with his sister in another town, but he couldn't escape what he had experienced. He tried therapy, medications, everything to quiet the constant paranoia. The nightmares persisted. At night, he'd see shadows moving in his peripheral vision, feel cold fingers brush against his arm, hear whispers in empty rooms. Months later, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Mark returned to the house during the day, hoping to at least confirm it was empty. He found it exactly as the police had left it, abandoned, dilapidated, yet somehow intact. The front door was open this time. He stepped inside cautiously, heart hammering. Then he saw it. A small, crudely carved symbol on the kitchen wall, fresh, as if made yesterday. His stomach dropped. It was a symbol he recognized from the internet, associated with rituals intended to summon and anchor spirits. But that wasn't possible. He had never touched it, never even known it existed until that moment. He backed away, intending to leave, when he heard the whisper again. "Welcome back." It was coming from inside the wall, behind the kitchen cabinets. Mark's fear overwhelmed him, and he ran. That night, he didn't sleep in his sister's house. He drove through the rain, aimless, until the sun rose. The whispers followed him, echoing in his mind. Over the next year, the occurrences became impossible to ignore. Objects moved in his sister's house. Shadows flitted across walls. Sometimes, when Mark was alone in his car, he'd see a dark figure standing in the rearview mirror, only to vanish when he turned around. Friends noticed his increasingly paranoid behavior, his reluctance to stay home, his obsession with avoiding certain places. Mark finally began documenting everything meticulously. He created a journal filled with descriptions, sketches, and notes of every event. Over time, a pattern emerged. Most incidents occurred on rainy nights, around 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., always when he was alone. The entity or entities seemed to follow him, attached to him, manifesting wherever he went. The final incident occurred one night when he stayed late at work. The building was nearly empty, just him and the cleaning crew. As he packed his bag to leave, he noticed the lights flicker. The temperature dropped sharply. He heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind. He turned quickly. Nothing. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder, cold and strong. He spun around again, and there was nobody there. Panicked, he ran to his car and drove, rain lashing against the windshield. He didn't stop until he reached a motel miles away, hoping to get some rest. That night, he saw it in his dreams, a faceless man standing at the foot of his bed, smiling. But this time, when he woke, he realized he wasn't dreaming. On the motel's security cameras, footage captured Mark asleep, and behind him, slowly approaching, was a figure. Not a shadow, not a trick of the camera. A man, faceless, dressed in tattered clothing, moving with deliberate purpose. Mark left the motel before sunrise, never to return. Now he lives constantly on the move. Every motel room, every apartment, every house feels temporary. The presence never leaves. He can feel it waiting, lurking in the shadows, whispering in the corners of his mind. Mark knows that he cannot escape, that no matter where he goes, it is there, watching, waiting, always patient, always deliberate. Mark's friends, the few who still keep in touch, have noticed the change. He doesn't answer the phone after dark. He avoids being home alone. Sometimes, late at night, they swear they hear him whispering to someone who isn't there. Mark Henderson's life, once normal, has become a relentless nightmare. He knows what he saw was real. The evidence, the experiences, the terror, none of it can be explained. The faceless man, whatever it is, exists in our reality, moving between houses, following people, haunting those unlucky enough to be noticed. Mark Henderson is one of the noticed. And he knows, deep down, that it will never stop. Story the end. It started in late February of 2016 when I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the west side of Cleveland. It wasn't in a nice neighborhood, but it wasn't the worst either. The building was old, built sometime in the 1920s, with creaky floors and radiators that hissed at night. The rent was cheap, which was exactly what I needed after my divorce. I didn't have much, just a bed, an old couch, and a coffee table I'd rescued from the curb. I figured it would do until I got my life sorted out again. The landlord, an older man named Howard, lived on the first floor. He was polite, quiet, and seemed to spend most of his days watching TV. He gave me the keys, warned me the plumbing was touchy, and told me to let him know if I ever heard strange noises coming from the basement. I thought he meant the pipes or maybe rats, so I nodded and didn't think much of it. The first few weeks were fine. I worked evenings at a logistics company and usually got home around midnight. The apartment was cold that time of year, but I bundled up and got used to the steady hum of the radiator. I started to notice, though, that around 2 or 3 in the morning, there was this faint tapping sound that came from the floor beneath my bedroom. It wasn't loud, more like a soft rhythmic knocking. I figured it was pipes, maybe expanding with the heat, and ignored it. But it kept happening, always the same time, always in the same spot. About a month later, I ran into Howard while checking my mail. He looked exhausted, his eyes were red, and he seemed jittery. I asked if everything was okay, and he said, "You hear the knocking?" That made me pause. I said, "Yeah, I thought it was the plumbing or something." He nodded slowly. "Plumbing, sure. Best not to go down to the basement after dark, though." I laughed a little, thinking he was joking. But he didn't laugh. He just said, "I mean it," and walked back inside his apartment. That night, I couldn't shake what he said. I tried to sleep, but the knocking started again, steady and slow, like someone tapping with one finger on the wood. I finally decided to check it out. The basement door was at the end of the hall, right next to the building's back exit. It was painted a dull green and had a padlock that looked older than I was. When I tried the handle, it was locked. I pressed my ear against it. The knocking was louder down there, clearer. It didn't sound like pipes. It sounded deliberate, like someone was signaling. I stood there for a minute, heart thudding, then went back to my apartment and told myself to stop acting paranoid. The next night, the sound started earlier, around 1:30. This time, I heard what sounded like a low scrape between the knocks. I put my ear to the floor, and I swear I could make out a faint rhythm, almost like breathing between the sounds. The next morning, I went to Howard's door and knocked. No answer. I tried again later that evening. Still nothing. His curtains were drawn, and I didn't hear the TV. I thought maybe he'd gone out of town. 2 days went by, and the knocking continued every night. On the third night, it stopped altogether. The silence was almost worse. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to something else, a muffled voice. It was low, male, and came from under the floor. It said, "Hello?" I froze. The voice sounded weak, hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. I got out of bed and knelt down. "Who's there?" I whispered. The voice came again, slightly louder this time. "Please, help me." I felt a chill go up my spine. It was definitely coming from the basement. I ran to the hallway, but the basement door was still locked. I didn't have the key, and I wasn't about to break it in the middle of the night. I went back to my apartment and called the police, explaining that I thought someone might be trapped downstairs. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. I led them to the door, and they tried knocking. No response. One of them, a younger cop, shined his flashlight through the keyhole, then shrugged. "We'll get the landlord," he said. They banged on Howard's door until finally he answered, bleary-eyed and confused. When they told him what I'd heard, he insisted there was no one down there. "Old pipes, that's all," he said. "This building makes sounds." One of the officers asked for the key, but Howard said he'd misplaced it. "The door's been locked for years," he added. "Nothing down there but junk." The cops eventually left after not hearing anything themselves. I was humiliated and angry, but more than anything, I was scared. The voice had been real. I knew it. The next morning, I went to work on almost no sleep. When I got home, I noticed something strange. Howard's apartment door was cracked open. I called his name, but there was no answer. I pushed it open a little and saw his TV still on, some news channel playing low. The place smelled off, like mildew and something sour. I stepped inside and found the living room empty, but his slippers were still by the recliner. Then I saw it, the basement key on his kitchen counter. I picked it up and stared at it. It was old brass, tarnished green around the edges, with a tag labeled "Basement." I don't know what made me do it, but I went straight down the hall and unlocked that door. The air that came up hit me like a wall, damp, heavy, and foul. It smelled like mold and rust and something else I couldn't place. The light switch didn't work, so I used my phone flashlight. The steps creaked under my weight as I went down. The basement was cluttered. Boxes, broken furniture, tools, and old appliances scattered everywhere. The knocking had stopped completely, but I still heard a faint sound. Not a voice this time. Breathing. I followed it toward the back wall, where there was an old wooden workbench. Behind it was a heavy metal hatch, like something you'd see in a storm shelter. It was bolted shut, but the bolts were rusted and loose. I bent down, put my ear against it, and nearly dropped my phone when I heard a whisper. "Please don't leave." I scrambled back up the stairs, locked the door, and ran to my apartment. I couldn't stop shaking. I tried calling the cops again, but halfway through the call, I hung up. How was I supposed to explain that? I didn't even understand what I'd seen. The next day, Howard still hadn't shown up. His car was still parked outside. I knocked again. No answer. Finally, that night, I decided to check the basement again. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I thought I could help whoever was down there. Maybe I was just curious in a way that overrides fear. I took a crowbar from my trunk and went back down the steps. My flashlight flickered, and I had to hit it a few times to keep it steady. The air felt even thicker than before. I went straight to the hatch. The whispering started again as I got closer. "Please, open it." My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I jammed the crowbar under the edge and started prying. The bolts screeched as they gave way. When the last one popped out, I hesitated, then pulled the hatch open. The smell that came out was so bad I gagged. It was the smell of rot and earth and something metallic. I shined my light inside and saw a narrow tunnel carved straight into the dirt. It looked old, like it had been there for decades. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I took a step closer, shining my light deeper into the hole. That's when I saw it, someone's hand. Pale, filthy, just inside the tunnel. I thought they were dead until the fingers twitched. I yelled, "I'm getting help!" and turned to run up the stairs. But as I did, I heard something else, a dragging sound behind me, fast, like someone crawling out of that hole. I sprinted up the steps, slammed the door, and locked it. I leaned against it, panting, listening. For a minute there was silence. Then something hit the door from the other side. Once, then again. Then a low scraping sound moved away into the basement. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for days. When the police finally came back, it was because another tenant had complained about the smell coming from the basement. They went down there and found the hatch wide open, the tunnel dug deeper than before. Inside it, they found bones. Dozens of them. They said they belonged to several different people, men, women, even a child. Some had been there for decades. The tunnel connected to an old storm drain system that ran under several blocks. They also found signs someone had been living down there recently. Blankets, food wrappers, even a radio. Howard was never found. They questioned everyone in the building, including me. I told them everything about the knocking, the voice, the hand. They listened, but didn't say much. One detective told me quietly that the bones matched reports of missing persons dating back to the 1970s. They thought someone, maybe multiple people, had used that tunnel to kidnap and hide victims for years. I moved out the next day. A few months later, I read an article saying they'd identified two of the victims through DNA, both from the 1980s. The article mentioned that police believed there might still be other tunnels connected to the old drain system. Some collapsed, some still open. They hadn't been able to search them all. For a while, I tried to put it behind me. I found a new place on the other side of town. But sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up convinced I heard that same faint knocking again, soft, rhythmic from somewhere beneath the floor. I told myself it was just in my head. That's what I still try to tell myself. But 3 weeks ago, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name on the envelope in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It said, "You shouldn't have opened it. He's not done yet." There were smudges on the page, muddy fingerprints, and one long streak of something dark brown that had dried. I took it to the police, but they couldn't trace it. They said it was probably a sick prank. Last night, the knocking came back. I moved into a new building, new part of town, solid concrete floors this time. But around 2:15 a.m. I heard it again. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I didn't sleep at all. This morning when I went to check my door, there was dirt on the welcome mat. Wet dirt, like someone had tracked it in from outside. I'm looking at it right now. I haven't called the cops yet. I don't know what I'd tell them, that something's following me, that some part of whatever was under that building found me again. All I know is the sound has started again, louder this time, And it's not coming from under the floor anymore. It's coming from the hallway. It's slow, deliberate. 3 knocks, then silence. Then from the other side of my front door, I hear that same hoarse whisper. Please, don't leave. Story the end. It started with a phone call that should have meant nothing. Just a number I didn't recognize late one Friday night in February of 2020. I was sitting in my small apartment in Fort Collins, Colorado, grading papers from my high school English class. The phone rang twice before I picked it up, thinking it might be one of my students or my sister in Denver. When I answered, no one spoke at first. There was this faint, uneven static, the kind that sounds like an old vinyl record crackling before the music starts. Then a voice came through, low and hoarse, like someone had been whispering for hours and lost their strength. Is this Lucas? I froze because the voice wasn't familiar, but the tone carried this odd certainty, like the caller wasn't asking to confirm. They already knew who I was. Yeah, I said, after a second. Who's this? The line went dead. Just silence. I waited another 30 seconds, listening for breathing or some kind of sound, but there was nothing. Then a faint click and the call ended. I thought it was just a wrong number. I even chuckled to myself, set the phone down, and went back to marking essays. But about 5 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Same number. I hesitated but answered anyway. Hello? This time, the same voice said, I need to tell you something. About the house. That's all. Then another click. I remember staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again, but it didn't. I checked the number. It was an Idaho area code, which meant nothing to me. I didn't know anyone in Idaho. I considered calling back, but stopped myself. Maybe it was a prank, maybe a scam, maybe just some confused old man dialing the wrong person. I didn't think about it again until the next day when I woke up to find a voicemail on my phone. It was from the same number. The message was 26 seconds of what sounded like wind and faint tapping, like someone tapping on glass in an uneven rhythm. Near the end, I could barely make out a whisper. Don't go in the basement. I didn't have a basement. That's when I started feeling uneasy. That day, I told my friend and coworker, Jenny, about it. She joked that it sounded like the beginning of a horror movie and told me to block the number. I laughed with her, pretending it was nothing, but something about that voice had lodged itself in my brain. Later that night, I did what anyone would do. I Googled the number. Nothing came up except for a few old forum posts about someone receiving calls from the same Idaho number years ago, saying weird things about houses and voices. But the posts were vague, like someone trying to get attention. One of them ended with, he told me the same thing, not to go in the basement. I didn't sleep much that night. The following Monday, after school, I got another call, this time from my mom. She said she'd found a property listing I might like to invest in. My mom had been helping me look for a house. I'd been saving for years, and I was finally close. She texted me the link while we talked. It was a beautiful place, an old, renovated home outside of Fort Collins, near the foothills. 2 stories, big yard, white shutters. The photos showed a wide porch and a narrow, tree-lined driveway. But when I clicked through the listing photos, one made my blood go cold. In one of the shots of the backyard, I could see a dark bulkhead door leading to what was obviously a basement. Something about it felt off, like I had seen it before. I went back to the photo again and zoomed in. The quality was grainy, but I thought I could make out faint smudges on the door, like someone had run their hands across it from the outside. The next day, the real estate agent called me to set up a viewing. I agreed, despite every instinct in me telling me not to. I met her at the house on a windy Thursday afternoon. The air smelled faintly of pine and wet dirt. The place looked even better in person. It was quiet out there, no neighbors in sight, just an open stretch of land leading to dense trees about 100 yards back. The agent, a cheerful woman named Carol, showed me around the main floor first. Spacious kitchen, hardwood floors, a big living room with a fireplace that looked barely used. Everything was perfect. Then we went upstairs to see the bedrooms. As we walked down the hallway, I felt this subtle vibration in the air. It wasn't sound. It was more like pressure, like when you drive into a tunnel and your ears pop slightly. Carol kept talking about insulation and plumbing, but I couldn't focus. The feeling grew heavier with every step, like the air was pushing against me. When she opened the door to the last bedroom, I immediately froze. The window blinds were half open, and through the glass, I could see the backyard. The bulkhead door stood out against the lawn like a wound in the earth. Carol noticed my pause. "Oh, that leads to the cellar," she said casually. "It's just storage, probably where they kept canning supplies or something." I nodded, but didn't move closer to the window. After she left me to explore on my own, I wandered downstairs again. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. A basement was normal. The call was a prank. Coincidence, nothing more. Still, I couldn't resist. I walked out the back door, the cold air biting at my face, and approached the bulkhead. The metal was old, painted gray, with faint streaks of rust near the hinges. I placed my hand on it. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, considering it had been sunny all day. For a moment, I thought I heard something from underneath, a sound like distant dripping. Then came a soft tap. Once, twice, then silence. I jerked my hand back, heart pounding. It could have been pipes, maybe a small animal, but it didn't feel right. It felt like someone had tapped back. I didn't open the door. I didn't even tell Carol what happened. I just thanked her and said I'd think about it. That night, I got another call. Same number. This time, when I picked up, the voice was clearer. "You looked at it, didn't you?" I nearly dropped the phone. "Who is this?" "They buried her there," the voice whispered. "That's why they can't sell it." "Who? What are you talking about?" There was a ragged inhale, then a noise I still can't describe, half sob, half hiss. Then the call ended. I blocked the number that night. But that didn't stop it. The next morning, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. They weren't mine. They were smaller, bare feet, the kind that would belong to a child. The door was still locked, the windows latched. I called the police, thinking maybe someone had broken in. They searched the apartment and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no mud outside. One of the officers gave me a skeptical look, clearly thinking I'd tracked the mud in myself. When they left, I scrubbed the floor until it was spotless. But that night, the footprints came back. Same pattern, same direction, from the door to my bed. I moved out 3 days later. I stayed with Jenny for a week while looking for another place. I didn't tell her about the calls or the footprints. I didn't want to sound insane. She noticed I wasn't sleeping much and kept asking if I was okay. I told her it was just stress. On my second night there, the block number left another voicemail. Jenny and I were sitting on her couch when my phone buzzed. I ignored it, but she saw the look on my face and asked who it was. When I said no one, she grabbed the phone from me and hit play. The message started with that same static, but this time there was something else underneath, a faint humming. It wasn't a song exactly, but it had rhythm, like someone humming through a closed mouth. Then came a single, rasped sentence. "You left the door open." Jenny paused the message and frowned. "Okay, that's messed up. What door?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the night before I moved out, I'd gone back to the house one last time to grab a few things, and I'd unlocked the door to my apartment before realizing I'd left something in the car. I was gone maybe 2 minutes. When I came back, the door was slightly ajar. I convinced myself it was just the wind. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. The same Idaho number kept trying to reach me, even from new phones. I'd get random calls at work, and sometimes the line would connect before hanging up again. My voicemail filled up with empty messages or faint sounds of breathing or that same humming. Then the real estate company called. They said the farmhouse had been taken off the market temporarily due to legal reasons. I asked what that meant, but the agent, Carol, didn't elaborate. I could tell she wanted to say more, but she just muttered something about an unresolved issue and hung up. About a week later, I found out what she meant. Jenny came into my classroom one morning, pale and shaken. She handed me her phone, showing a local news article. It said that human remains had been discovered on a property north of Fort Collins, the same one I had toured. The body had been buried beneath the basement floor. The article didn't mention a name, just that the remains belonged to a woman, estimated to have been dead for over 30 years. I didn't know what to think. It could have been anyone. But then I scrolled to the bottom of the article and saw the address. It was the same house. For the next few days, I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself the calls were a coincidence. But I couldn't shake one thought. How had that voice known? I had nightmares for weeks, dreams where I was walking down that basement staircase, the air thick and wet, and I'd hear someone behind me whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced someone was standing in the corner of the room. Then, just when things started to settle down, a letter arrived at my mailbox. It had no return address, but the postmark said Idaho Falls. My stomach dropped. Inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper with shaky handwriting that read, "You listened. That means she can find you now." That night, I heard knocking. 3 slow knocks on my apartment door at 2:14 a.m. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The knocking stopped after a minute. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of someone humming on the other side. I sat frozen on my bed, clutching my phone, staring at the door. After maybe 10 minutes, I gathered the courage to look through the peephole. There was no one there, but the carpet outside my door had small, wet footprints leading away, bare feet again, smaller than mine. I moved to Denver the next morning. I changed my number, deleted my social media, even switched schools. For a while, it helped. No calls, no messages, no knocks, until one afternoon last summer, I got an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line said, "Basement." The message was one sentence long. "You left the door open again." I stared at it for what felt like hours. There was no attachment, no signature, just those words. I deleted the message, blocked the address, and threw my laptop into the closet for a week. But the next day, when I went to take the trash out, I saw a muddy footprint on my porch. Bare. Small. Just one. I don't know if she's real. I don't know who made those calls or how they knew about that house. But I do know this. Sometimes when I wake up at night, I hear a faint tapping sound from the floorboards beneath my bed. It's slow, rhythmic, like someone knocking from underneath. I tell myself it's just the pipes or maybe mice. But when I lean down and listen close, I swear I can hear the same voice whispering through the wood grain. "Don't go in the basement." Story the end. It was sometime in early November of 2016 when everything started to unravel in a way that I still struggle to understand. I had just moved to a quiet town in northern Illinois called Winthrop Harbor after getting a job as a night security guard for a small industrial warehouse. The pay wasn't great, but I'd been desperate to get out of Chicago, away from the chaos, the noise, and the constant sense that life was pushing me towards some kind of invisible edge. The town was calm, almost too calm, and most of the residents were either old or families who'd lived there for generations. My job was simple: make rounds around the facility every 2 hours, check the locks, and make sure no one was sneaking in to steal tools or scrap metal. The warehouse sat alone at the end of a long, cracked road bordered by trees and marshland. In daylight, it looked ordinary: gray metal siding, gravel lots, stacks of wooden pallets. But at night, it had a different character altogether. The silence was heavy, and the darkness out there wasn't the same kind of darkness I'd known in the city. This one felt alive, as if it pressed against the chain-link fences and watched from the trees. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd bring a thermos of coffee, make my rounds, then sit in the little guard shack by the entrance. It was a box barely big enough for a desk, a chair, and a heater that made a loud ticking noise every time it kicked on. Sometimes I'd listen to the radio or scroll through my phone, anything to pass the hours until dawn. But as Thanksgiving approached, I started noticing small things that felt off. The first thing was the footsteps. Around midnight one night, I was doing my walk around the north side of the building when I heard what I thought was someone stepping on gravel just a few yards behind me. I spun around immediately, flashlight aimed at the sound, but there was no one there. Just the echo of my own breath and the faint rustle of wind through the marsh grass. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd stepped on a loose rock or my boot had shifted weirdly, but after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. 2 nights later, I was back on shift when my supervisor, a guy named Rick, called to let me know one of the motion lights on the loading dock had gone out. I went to check it, and as I was replacing the bulb, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, something darting between 2 stacks of shipping containers about 30 yards away. I froze. I was sure it wasn't an animal. It was too tall. I called out, "Hey, this is private property," but nothing answered. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the open air. After that night, I started bringing my dog, Milo, a small German Shepherd mix I'd rescued 2 years earlier. The company didn't officially allow pets on site, but I figured no one was checking, and I felt safer with him around. He was calm most of the time, but that first night I brought him, his behavior made my stomach tighten. As soon as we got near the loading docks, his ears went flat and his body stiffened. His growl was low, almost a vibration in his throat. He was looking toward the same area where I'd seen the movement days earlier. I walked over slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam swept across the containers, the fence line, and the perimeter where the marsh began. Everything looked still, but Milo refused to move any closer. When I tried to tug his leash, he whined and backed up, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I remember saying aloud, "There's nothing there," just to calm myself down. But deep inside, I didn't believe it. About a week later, Rick asked me to cover an extra shift, Sunday night into Monday morning, since another guard called in sick. That night was colder than usual, a heavy fog rolling in from Lake Michigan. The air smelled damp, and even the floodlights struggled to cut through it. Around 2:30 a.m., I was inside the warehouse, checking the main floor. The metal walls creaked softly with the wind outside, and the only sound was my boots echoing against the concrete. That's when I heard something from the far end of the building, a sharp metallic clang, like a chain being dropped. I followed the noise, flashlight sweeping across the aisles of storage racks. When I reached the last row, I saw a chain lying on the ground, still slightly swaying. It wasn't there earlier. That chain was usually hooked to a gate that blocked off the mechanical equipment area. My pulse quickened. Someone had to be inside with me. "Milo, come," I whispered, and he padded quietly at my side. I aimed my light toward the corner, and that's when I saw it. Something pale moving just beyond the last rack, slow, almost deliberate. For a moment I thought it was a person, maybe a trespasser or even one of the workers playing a prank. But as it turned toward the light, I realized it wasn't like anyone I'd ever seen. The shape of its head was wrong, too long, too narrow. And its skin, if that's what it was, looked grayish, almost translucent. I froze completely. Milo began barking, a frantic, guttural sound that echoed through the warehouse. The figure moved fast after that. It turned and disappeared behind the racks, and by the time I reached the spot, there was nothing there. No footprints, no sound, nothing. I tried to tell myself my mind was playing tricks in the fog and dim light, but I couldn't shake the image of that thing's silhouette burned into my memory. The next morning, when Rick showed up for his shift, I told him everything. He laughed at first, thinking I was exaggerating, but when I mentioned the chain being moved, he got quiet. "You're not the first guard to say weird stuff happens here," he said finally. "Guy before you quit after a month said he was hearing voices out back." I thought he was nuts. That made me feel worse. Over the next few nights, things escalated. I started finding small, wet footprints near the loading dock, like bare human feet, but smaller than an adult's. They led from the back door out into the marsh grass and then stopped abruptly. I'd mop them up, only to find them again an hour later. Milo's behavior got worse too. He would bark at corners of the building, hackles raised, and sometimes refuse to go inside altogether. One night in early December, everything came to a breaking point. I remember because it was snowing for the first time that winter, the flakes thick and silent against the floodlights. I was sitting in the shack around midnight, drinking coffee and scrolling through my phone when the security monitor flickered. For a split second, one of the camera feeds, the one facing the north entrance, went static. When it came back, I saw something standing just outside the gate. It looked like a person at first, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it seemed. The body was thin, elongated, the arms hanging lower than they should, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and even through the grainy image, I could see that its mouth was open far wider than humanly possible. I froze completely, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Milo started growling again, pacing back and forth in front of the shack window. The thing on the monitor didn't move. It just stood there, facing the camera, its mouth still open. I grabbed my flashlight and the keys, forcing myself to go outside, though every instinct screamed not to. The snow was falling heavier now, crunching under my boots as I approached the gate. When I got there, there was nothing. just the sound of wind and the steady hiss of snowfall. I swept my light across the field, the fence, the road. No footprints, no signs of anything. But when I looked back toward the shack, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The shack's door was wide open and the light inside was flickering. Milo was barking furiously from within. I ran back as fast as I could, slipping on the icy ground. When I burst inside, the barking stopped instantly. Milo was in the corner, trembling, staring at the small window. On the glass, there was a handprint. Not a normal handprint. It was long, thin, with what looked like 6 fingers pressed against the fogged glass. I didn't last much longer after that. I told Rick I was done, gave him my notice the next day, and tried to forget the whole thing. But it didn't end when I left. For weeks afterward, I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced someone was standing in my bedroom doorway. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a long shadow just beyond the light from the street. Milo would bark at the hallway for no reason, his tail tucked tight between his legs. One night I heard the same metallic clanging I'd heard in the warehouse coming from my basement. I moved out of Winthrop Harbor by January, went to live with my cousin in Madison, Wisconsin. For a while, I thought things had finally settled. I got a new job, started sleeping again, though I still kept the lights on. Then one night, I took Milo out for a walk around 11 p.m. The neighborhood was quiet, the air crisp and still. We were halfway down the block when he stopped dead, growling low. I looked up, and there, standing under a streetlight across the street, was that same tall figure. The way it stood, the tilt of its head, it was identical. I blinked, and it was gone. I don't know what it was I saw back then or why it seemed to follow me. Sometimes I wonder if it was something about that place, something in the land or in the marshes behind the warehouse. Other times I think it attached itself to me, maybe feeding off my fear, following me from one town to another. I've moved 3 times since then, once to Ohio, then to Minnesota, and finally to Kansas. Every so often I'll catch that same feeling again late at night, that prickle on the back of my neck like someone's standing just behind me. A few months ago, I was cleaning my car windshield one morning before work and noticed a faint handprint near the bottom of the glass. 6 long fingers, spaced too wide to belong to any human hand. That's when I stopped trying to rationalize it. I stopped telling myself it was just imagination, stress, or fatigue. Whatever it is, it's real, and it's patient. It waits. I've started leaving the lights on in every room, even when I sleep. Milo's older now, doesn't bark much anymore, but some nights he still stands at the front door, staring out the window, tail lowered, eyes fixed on something only he can see. And every now and then I'll hear that faint metallic clanging again, soft, rhythmic, like a chain being dragged across concrete, and I know deep down that no matter how far I go, it's still with me. Story the end.